Welcome back to Talk of Christ, Faith, Family, and Adventure. I'm Steve Hunt, the consultant for Prosperity and Adventure. I'm joined again by Joey Day as we continue our discussion. This is part 2 of our discussion on the Trinity. This is and Joey's response, our response collectively to the Latin Trinity, Scripture, and Logic, which was an episode on the Exploring Mormon Thought podcast. And again, we've already done a discussion about this, and let's see, that's interesting. I just noticed that YouTube is putting me on the side of the screen that I didn't expect. So anyway, yeah, we've already done one of these YouTube discussions that I encourage anybody who's watching this to go back and watch, where you talked about kind of what is the Trinity, and specifically this idea of the 4 points that Blake Ostler brings up that he says are contradictory, right? That there is one God,
right?
That the Father is God, that Jesus Christ, the Son, is God, and that the Father and the Son are not identical persons.
The Father is not the Son.
Yeah, there we go. The Father is not the Son.
The simplest way I would
express it. So that seems to lead to logical contradiction. We discussed that, and now you want to go forward with some other parts. Before we do, since I'm taking a moment to notice kind of how YouTube has put me now on the right side of the screen as opposed to the left, that means that you are over to my, over here. You're to my.
So if I look that way, it looks like I'm looking at you.
And if I look this, let's see, you look like you are looking at me when you look away from the gentleman who is frozen over your shoulder. Yeah, there you go. Okay. There we go.
Wait, I just noticed in our last video, I was commenting before we started that, boy, it looks like I'm looking away from you all the time in the last video. So
yeah. So, and also
not that it matters, but
no, it's kind of funny. I tend to look directly into the camera anyway. That's my, And then we're wearing red shirts today. We do have, we
got the memo.
Yeah. And we have virtually identical shirts. We've worn these in person. And I think they are I think they're the same shirt. So, or just about. And you said something about one of us has to die now.
Can't see. Yeah, Star Trek. If we were on an away mission, one of us would die. The red shirts.
There are, so they would wear different uniforms, but the red shirted one on the away mission.
And we are kind of on an away mission because it's just the 2 of us, right? We've left the other members of our open faith discussion on the ship, and we're down here on planet Trinity doing an away mission. So,
well, the
look out.
Fact is, of course, we will
watch your back.
Die. So
maybe. Well, eventually, on an infinite time scale. We will both die.
And what is the God that we shall meet when we die? So go ahead and let's.
That is at issue. Yeah. Well, so before we launch into any topic, I've got some follow up from our last episode, and I'm going to try to rapid fire these out. But I said actually 2 videos ago, one of the first videos that you and I did together, which was our Continental Divides video. I made a comment that everyone going into the Nicene Council agreed on the creator-creature distinction. And we had a commenter comment on that video and point out, hey, I think he's wrong about that. And so in our last video that we did, part 1 of this 2-parter, I said, oh, well, when I said that, I was following this guy who wrote this book. I went and looked up the book and found the direct quotes, and I was wrong. What he said, that everyone going into the Council of Nicaea, what they all agreed on was not the creator-creature distinction. What he said they agreed on was ex nihilo creation. And he said that the idea of a creator-creature distinction was emerging right around the time when they convened the council. And so that was one of the things that
seems logically to follow from ex nihilo creation, right? That if God created everything out of nothing, then are you part of the God, or are you part of the created nothing?
Right. Yeah, they seemed very tightly coupled ideas. But if you thought I was quoting Mr. Khaled Anatolios in his book, I actually was misquoting him slightly. So
So
I
you're
think,
still arguing then that at least the ex nihilo creation was settled before the council.
yeah,
And that, again, leads, like I say, if that's what everybody truly believed at the time, then it would seemingly lead easily to the discussion of, well, okay, was Jesus God or was he created ex nihilo?
Right. And I think in our continental divides discussion that we had, I think the way I expressed it was that, like, there was no one there representing you at the Council of Nicaea. And I still think that's basically true. If everyone at the Council of Nicaea agreed on ex nihilo creation, then, then there was no one there representing your position. And I think I even back then, this was a long time ago when we had our continental divides video, but I even said, like, does that mean the apostasy was all done and gone, over by then? Like, everybody was apostate, So anyway,
well, and I think from a general Latter-day Saint position, I think that is the case, right? The council was in 329. When was it exactly? Do you remember the year?
325. Yeah, 4th century. So
yeah, and so we're several hundred years after John the Beloved died, and his book was the last written, correct? That was Revelation, the last of the biblical. And so, we had no more apostles living, and that from a purely Orthodox Latter-day Saint position, the apostasy would have existed when the apostles no longer were on the earth. So, all right.
Another thing I said last video, I said that Arius was a bishop, but he actually wasn't. He was a presbyter or an elder, and he took issue with what his bishop was teaching. His bishop was Alexander, and this was the church in Alexandria. He took issue with what his bishop Alexander was teaching, because Alexander was teaching the co-equality of the Son with the Father, and so Arius actually accused Alexander of modalism. So that's interesting. And what happened was that Alexander actually excommunicated Arius, but then he went to, like, some neighboring towns and found supporters and started a movement, and so it was actually Alexander that called the Council of Nicaea to, like, hey, we got to figure this out. So that was another correction I wanted to make. I think I even said last video, like, I'm going to get all this history wrong if I try to, like, just go off the cuff, and I got some of it wrong. One thing I didn't get wrong, though, is that Constantine was baptized on his deathbed by an Arian bishop. Bishop Eusebius of Nicomedia was the guy who baptized Constantine on his deathbed, and he was a self-avowed Arian. So
had Constantine been baptized previously, though? It's just that Oh, really?
No.
I mean,
so one of the things, so Eusebius, I think, was a sort of a lifelong counselor for Constantine. And one of the ideas that Eusebius taught was that baptism is a one-time thing that washes away all your sin. And so it's better to wait. It's better to wait until you're, like, about to die and then do it, right? And then you've got a clean slate when you die and head off to judgment.
If you're lucky enough to know when you're going to die, that's great.
Right.
I actually had a great grandfather who was baptized at 101 years old into the Latter-day Saint Church.
Wow.
He did die
for the same reason, or it was just how it worked out.
There's stories, and I should learn them better, because he lived with and among the Latter-day Saints in Idaho. He was kind of raised there. His family were all members, and he just kind of abstained until that. I think maybe for the same reason he wanted to wait.
Interesting.
The last moment, but that's funny, though, because in early Latter-day Saint theology and history, you could get baptized multiple times. I know that people were rebaptized, so that doesn't, I don't know when that stopped, but anyway, all right, back to the Trinity.
Another thing that I said, I've got 2 more points of follow-up. Sorry.
Okay.
I said that I probably wouldn't use the word identical in my definition of the Trinity the way Ostler does, but actually I was reading, and one of my favorite authors on the Trinity, Scott Swain, totally does use the word identical in his definition of the Trinity. So, and then we had talked about some of the texts that I think show clearly that the Father is Yahweh. And the one that I had pulled out, I had kind of said, oh, this may not be one of the best ones. I can pull better ones if you want. I've pulled a few better ones, so we can review those if you want. We don't have to, but
so that's the Father is Yahweh.
Yeah.
And I mean, that was the one where we kind of skipped. Well, I remember, because we were clear that the Father is God. The question is whether, when we're talking about Jehovah, whether the Father is Jehovah. Do you have one really, really good one that we should take a look at? What's the best one? Or
Psalm 110:1. Psalm chapter 110, verse 1.
110 verse 1. Let's see. Let me get that pulled up here on. Okay, here we go. Yahweh said unto my Lord, and it's not capitalized, so Yahweh said it to my Lord, the Lord of David, right? Who's writing this? That's the Lord of David. Sit thou at my right hand. So you come sit over here until I make thine enemies thy footstool. And so the verse seems to be God Yahweh speaking to the Son of God, that David was
the Messiah, the anointed one, the Christ.
Yeah, that David would not have been terribly, terribly familiar with, because at this point in the Old Testament, revelation about the coming Christ Messiah was less understood. It was there. We see it in the Old Testament now. And later, though, we have from Acts, this is linked in my King James Latter-day Saint.
Yeah, it's actually quoted in 4 different places in the New Testament.
Yeah, because they're saying, look, David had a Lord, and that Lord was Jesus.
Right. I think it was Jesus that actually points it out. He raises this verse and asks the people, well, if David calls him Lord, how could he be David's son? How could he be a descendant of David if David calls him Lord?
Meaning he's talking about himself. If David calls
and he's talking about himself,
Messiah, Lord, then how am I David's son?
In the 4 places where that passage is quoted in the New Testament, the Father is always associated with Yahweh speaking, and it's the Son, Jesus, who's associated with the other Lord.
So the New Testament authors who read this, Psalms 110, where David wrote this, he's saying Yahweh to the Messiah. And so that's how we can say, okay, God the Father then is, in this instance, his name is written in the Old Testament as Yahweh, Jehovah. And so this is a great verse showing that the Father could be Yahweh, as long as
I think that one's better than the Hosea one that I pulled last time.
As long as we're willing to accept that the lowercase Lord in this case is referring to Christ the Messiah, which is what the New Testament authors all seem to do, including Jesus.
Yeah. Yep.
But it does seem a little bit interesting that David was kind of referring to a 2-person Trinity when that wasn't very clear at David's time. Right. So.
Right. Yeah. I would not say that David understood, any sort of Trinitarian doctrine, but it's certainly, I believe, interpreted that way by all the New Testament writers who quote that passage. So.
All right.
Okay. That is all my follow-up. So let's dive in to. So 3 points. We said this at the end of the last video, and apparently I cut out a little bit. Actually, I should check to see if I'm going to cut out today. I have 3 different wireless access points in my house, and I think depending on which access point I'm connected to, it causes me to cut out in Zoom. Yeah, I'm connected to the living room. I'm going to disconnect for half a sec. Hopefully you don't lose me.
Oh, all right. Okay. So, you've frozen here. I'll go ahead and, there, you're back now, it looks like.
I'm connected to a better access point, so hopefully we won't have any connection issues. But at the tail end of our last video, we kind of gave a little quick summary of what we wanted to talk about in this one. First, I want to address some points that Ostler makes about, he seems to kind of go back and forth on whether the Trinitarianism just is modalism, or whether people who are attempting to express Trinitarianism accidentally express modalism instead. So we've got a couple clips pulled aside for that I want to listen to and comment on. Then I want to talk about, I want to try to address head on. He says, if we do somehow find a way to avoid modalism on the one hand or tritheism on the other hand, and we try to take this middle way, well, that middle way is just a bald-faced contradiction. There's nothing we can do about it, right? Yeah. So I want to talk about those. I have a couple clips for that, and I want to talk about those. And then the last thing I want to address is he really takes issue with the way and specifically he's addressing something that Cardinal Ratzinger said. Cardinal Ratzinger was a prominent theologian in the Catholic Church, later became the Pope, and I believe he's the one that very uncharacteristically sort of retired from being the Pope, right? He's, I believe, still alive. But he made a statement before he was the Pope that anybody who doesn't believe in the Trinity can't be saved. And he made that a pronouncement, like an official pronouncement of the Catholic Church. And Ostler really kind of, he has disdain for that position. And so I want to talk about, like, is it even appropriate? Are we overstepping the bounds of what Scripture says when we make this claim that, like, if you don't believe in the Trinity, you can't be saved?
Well, and the question is, of course, it arises too whether you care what Cardinal Ratzinger and Pope,
right? I don't.
Yeah,
I don't. But I can pull similar statements from my own tradition and from the earliest creeds. So I still am susceptible to that same, criticism. So, okay. So starting with modalism, I want to play, I don't know what order to play these clips in, but this first clip I think is actually Jake Ostler asking his father a question, and he's reading a section from the book, from Ostler's book, Exploring Mormon Thought, Volume 3. This is chapter 6. He's reading a statement from the book where in the book, he's talking about modalism. Okay. And I want you to hear, and again, this is Ostler speaking off the cuff, so maybe he just misspeaks here, but I want you to hear kind of how the conversation proceeds from that point. I need to share, and then I need to go to advanced and share computer audio. Okay, and then I'll play this clip.
And I think you kind of already went over this with the Clark Kent Superman analogy with modalism, but you said it's like asserting that there's just one being who is Superman, Clark Kent, and the top male reporter for the Daily Planet, just one person who appears as three different roles. Now, there's nothing incoherent or unintelligible about such a claim, but such an approach makes nonsense of the New Testament claims for the relation of the Father to the Son.
Yeah, such as that no one would say that the Father sent the Father sent the Son. And so the Son has a property that the Father doesn't have, and that's being sent by the Father. The Son doesn't pray to the Son prays to the Father. The Father, therefore, has a property the Son doesn't have, and that is being the object of the prayers of the Son, and the Son doesn't pray to himself. So when we start breaking down what the New Testament actually says about the divine persons, it's nonsense to say that they're just the same being in the sense that they are just one same thing identically. And that's the kind of problem that I'm highlighting with the Latin Trinity.
Whoops. Okay, so you hear, like, right at the tail end, he says, and this is the problem I'm highlighting with the Trinity. And I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. Everything I was agreeing with you right up until you said that, right? Because those are all, like, I love every one of those criticisms of modalism is totally valid, right? The Father didn't send the Father. The Son isn't praying to the Son. And again, I think Ostler does a better job in the book of keeping all these things separated, of saying that, like, because in the book, that section Jake was reading, he's talking about modalism, and he gives all these criticisms of modalism, right? But then in the podcast,
this moment established that fourth point that we were talking about on the last one, that the Father and the Son are not identical. And so, and then, and the Trinity upholds that fourth point. And so when he's attacking this and saying the Father and the Son aren't identical, he's supporting the Trinity against modalism, right?
Right. Yeah. And again, so now here's one thing that he does do in the book. He distinguishes between different kinds of Trinitarianism, even in this clip that I just played, he called it Latin Trinitarianism, right? This is the problem that I have with the Latin Trinity. And I think the claim that he's making is that the Latin Trinity leans modalistic, because he also talks about something he calls substance Trinitarianism, and he might even mention that in one of these later clips that I have. But anyway, so I don't want to make too much hay out of what he was saying, but because I think the Latin Trinity for him is what leans in a modalistic direction. So
okay, but anyway, is this the same point you wanted to make where or is there another thing you want to listen to where he's basically saying that most Trinitarians, lay Trinitarians, tend to explain?
Yeah, let me play this next clip. So of that clip that we just played, if what he is really saying is that Trinitarianism is just modalism, then I think he's propping up a straw man. But I'm not sure that's what he's saying. So I don't want to make too much hay out of it.
That's the straw man that most Latter-day Saints get into when discussing other religions, without those other religions present, without a real Trinitarian present. They tend to say, how can they possibly believe this? Is just absurd to believe that God and Jesus are the same being, which you do say, but the word is the being. It means something different than what we think the being means. And we think we're using it as they're the same person, and which I still admit.
Yeah, that's exactly what I want to comment on. Let me play this next clip, and I've got actually 2 more clips, I think, and then I want to comment on exactly what you just said, because it's kind of the same thing he's saying anyway. So here's the next clip.
When a person says that the Father is the same being as the Son in the Trinity, which they say all the time, they use the word being, but the father of Corey is the same being as the father of Jacob is the same being as Blake Ostler. Yet they're not 3 individual persons involved here. There's only one person. So that's modalism, as you've already pointed out. When I talk with traditional Christians who are telling me about the Trinity, most often what they come up with is just a form of modalism. Modalism was recognized essentially as a heresy very, very early on, and clearly was rejected at Nicaea as well as a legitimate resolution to any of the problems. So it was rejected by the majority of the churches in favor of what I would call the substance Trinitarianism. The Athanasian Creed is probably the most important where it was rejected.
And let me go ahead and play the next clip too, and then we'll comment.
Modalism.
Okay, I just mean, like, if you talk to Christians today and they say something, and then you're like, oh, well, don't you see that that's just modalism? They would understand. They're like, oh, no, that's something I want to avoid. Or they're like, yeah, so what?
Well, most traditional Christians don't know that modalism is a heresy. You have to point it out to them and then say, but you've got to understand that's a heresy. Not even your church accepts it. They accept what they call substance Trinitarianism, which is a different belief. Substance Trinitarianism is the attempt to avoid modalism and the attempt to avoid polytheism with a logical contradiction.
Okay, so, and that'll segue us into the next, but so, and you probably caught it. I think you raised an eyebrow in the first clip that I just played. He starts out saying that when a person says that the Father is the same being as the Son in the Trinity, which they say all the time, and he concludes that that's just modalism. That is modalism. Anytime somebody says that the Father is the same being as the Son, that just is modalism. And that's a statement that I would say, as a Trinitarian, I would say that statement.
Yeah.
But to me, all I'm saying when I say that statement is that I affirm the first and second and third premises of the 4 premises, right? Acceptance of those 3 premises does not make me a modalist. What makes me a modalist would be denial of the 4th one, right? So, if he really believes that the premises, if you've still got them,
I've got them, but I can't share it while you're still sharing the sound, so it's okay. But we've already addressed them, so yeah.
So the premises were: there's only one God, the Father is God, the Son is God, and the Father is not the Son, right?
And so accepting the first 3 doesn't make you a modalist, although logically Blake Ostler was saying by accepting the first 3, you must deny the 4th.
And I'll give him that. If his point is that acceptance of those first 3, no matter whether you accept or deny the 4th one, the acceptance of those first 3 just makes you a modalist. I guess he can say that. I disagree. I mean, it's one thing to say. It's one thing to say like someone else should.
The transitive property of mathematics that he's using, just a logical, point, right? If you're saying that there is one God and the Father is God and the Son is God, then they must be the same identical being, because if A equals C and B equals C, then A equals B, right? And so that's where he's getting that from, is a logical point. But you and I have had these discussions in the past before, where we say, look, your premises lead logically to this point, and the other person says, I don't agree that they do.
I don't follow. Yeah. So if he's claiming that logically my belief is necessarily modalism, then my retort to that would just be, well, regardless, I don't follow it there, right?
So what does that mean, though, when you take a position? And I'm sure that I have these similar things in my own faith, and so this is not a specific critique of your faith, but we have this in front of you right now. You take something that appears, here's what it means. I think I know the answer to my own question, but you take something that appears to logically lead to a conclusion, and you just simply deny the conclusion. You're not doing that just because you're saying, yeah, I see the logic and I deny it. What I think you're doing is you're saying, all right, we have a difference of opinion on the definition of a couple of the words in the premises, right? We need to qualify the premises just a little bit. And I, like I say, when I look at those 4 premises, I was saying in the last video, I actually agree with them too. I agree with the scripture that says there's one God. I agree God, that the Father is God, the Son is God, and I agree the Father and the Son aren't the same. So if I agree with all 4 of them, I must have a way out. They don't contradict. You must as well. And my way out, I said last time, tends to be by saying that there is one God. There's some nuance there. And I feel like you have a similar nuance in saying that there is one being, God, and then there are 3 persons in that being. Right. And so that is, again, where you still want to stick to one being God. I say, why can't we just call that a Godhead? Anyway, but it's anyway. Yeah,
I would definitely disagree with so if Ostler is saying that acceptance of those first 3 premises naturally leads to the conclusion of modalism, you're right. I would not agree with him and say, oh yes, it does naturally lead to that conclusion, but I just deny that conclusion. My argument would be, no, I don't think that it actually leads to that conclusion.
But again, is that because you want to nuance?
Well, it has a lot to do with the fact that I do accept the 4th premise, and that I don't feel like it's an outright contradiction, which we'll get to in a minute. But
again, I'm just pressing on this. You don't feel it's an outright contradiction because of the way you define in a challenging definition the word God, right? Or not just the word God, but like the being of God.
We'll get into that, and I don't want to get ahead of myself here because I want to finish these thoughts about modalism, because I do want to get into that. I will get into that.
Yeah, but I get where we're going. Okay, right now the point is simply that just by accepting the first 3 doesn't mean you're a modalist in your mind.
And so once again, I would say he's propping up a straw man argument and saying that, like, oh, just because I say that the Son and the Father are the same being, it's not modalism. If he's trying to say that is necessarily modalism, I think he's propping up a straw man. So, but the other thing he's saying in these 2 clips, the other thing he's saying is that when I talk with traditional Christians who are telling me about the Trinity, most often what they come up with is just a form of modalism. And I will 100% follow him down that line of argumentation or reasoning, right? Like, I think he's absolutely right. But so he says, when I talk to Christians who are telling me about the Trinity, what they come up with most often is modalism. I would actually argue that it's going to depend a lot on context. It's going to depend a lot on who we're talking to. Here's the thing. Whenever a Latter-day Saint and an evangelical talk about the Trinity, where is the evangelical going to go first? If we're arguing about the Trinity, probably that evangelical is going to go straight to verses like the Shema. They're going to launch into, talking about the doctrine of simplicity, right? And they're going to go to all those verses that talk about the being of God being one, the Father and the Son being the same, consubstantial, right? The same substance. We're going to go there because that's the point of friction that we have with Latter-day Saints. Would you agree with that?
And this is because the Latter-day Saints will talk about Jesus and God the Father appearing to Joseph Smith, and we're inclined to say
saying that they're 2 separate.
Yeah, three
Yeah.
persons of the Godhead. And in fact,
Mhm.
we have been absolutely, we can be accused of saying there are three gods. And
Right.
Joseph Smith, I think, even said it that way. And so
Mhm.
was he talking about, a tritheism, a plurality of gods?
Right.
And the truth is, because I think that we don't really understand what it means specifically when we say that we are children of God and can become like God and can become gods.
Mhm.
And we don't necessarily understand. You've got to define, again, it's this definition of what is a God or what is God that comes to bear. And so, to your ears, to an evangelical's ears, we're
Mhm.
tritheists.
Right.
And so you will
And so the line of
immediately go
argumentation
and
we will launch upon is, I want to defend premise number one of these four premises, And what happens is, if we're not careful to explain that we actually do affirm all four of the premises, the danger is that as we represent ourselves as affirming premise number one, that the person on the other side of that debate is going to start to assume, oh, they must deny premise four. They must think that the Father and the Son are just identical. And I think that's natural, and it's our fault. I'm saying that it's our fault that we sort of accidentally misrepresent ourselves as modalists, because in that moment we're trying to argue against tritheism. And it's funny because if you go and look for a debate between a Trinitarian and a modalist, you will see them both using the very same proof texts that would be flying around in a debate between a Latter-day Saint and a Trinitarian, except the Trinitarian will be using your favorite verses, right? The Jesus's baptism, Jesus praying to the Father, right? And what happens is the modalist will start to assume that the Trinitarian is actually a tritheist, right? So it depends on context, and it depends on who we're debating with, that if we're not careful to articulate the fully orbed doctrine of the Trinity, the danger is that we will accidentally present ourselves as either modalists or tritheists or whatever, right? Because of the scriptures that we're harping on, or the proof texts we're using, and or because of the analogies we use, or the way we explain it, right? So I think the reason why Ostler most often encounters a modalist understanding of the Trinity is because he's a Latter-day Saint, and the people he's engaging in debates with or discussions, dialogue, are accidentally representing themselves as modalists because of the context. I don't know if that's true or not. But I will point to things like Ligonier every year does, or every other year, I think they do a state of theology survey where they survey I don't know, 1,000 random people or something, and one of the questions they asked back in, I think it was 2014, they asked if Jesus was a created being. And 59% of the evangelical respondents said, no, Jesus is not a created being, which means something like 31% or 41% of evangelicals answered the question, yes, Jesus is a created being. So that makes like, or that they don't know. But that makes like 40% of evangelicals, according to this survey, and it's one data point, right? That makes them Arians, right? So I would push back on Ostler's claim that most people who try to explain the Trinity end up explaining modalism, because if you went and asked one of those 40%, they would explain it in an Arian way or a subordinationist way, right? Presumably. So I think it's just more common that Ostler encounters a modalist explanation because of the context.
Well, let's put it
this way. So that's my take on that.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think what you're basically saying is that other heresies crop up probably as well, just as often. And so the question, I suppose, is if you were to try to pin down what percentage of the people in your congregation and generally in evangelical Christianity around the world, or even Orthodox Christianity, Catholicism and Russian Orthodox, and whatever, I assume they all ascribe to the Trinity. That's why this is one reason why Latter-day Saints are not considered Christian versus all of these other Orthodox and Protestant religions and churches, is because they all adhere to this idea of the Trinity. And I want to eventually get to the point as to whether or not, just how closely my own beliefs in Latter-day Saint theology is to the Trinity. We haven't addressed that quite yet. But because we don't say that we follow these creeds about the Trinity, then we're not Christian. And so my question is, in the Christian world, what percent of people do you think do clearly understand this idea and could explain all of these points that are seemingly contradictory and defend one God and defend three persons?
I don't know, and that is a totally valid thing that we ought to look at. And I think that's a little more. That question will be more appropriate in the third when we get to that third point of, like, do you have to believe the Trinity to be a Christian or not? And so I do want to talk about that, but no, he's absolutely, and this is the criticism that Ostler brings to the fore right at the beginning of his chapter is, if you're going to hold me to this standard of I have to believe in the Trinity, well, do you even hold yourselves to that standard? Because I pick a random evangelical off the street and he can't explain the Trinity to me, so does that mean he's not saved? And I think I would say yes. I think there's certain propositions you have to be able to say, yeah, that's what I believe, or you're not saved. And so I think it is something that evangelicals have to be very careful.
So have we moved to that topic then? Or are we on to this idea?
I don't want to quite yet, because I do want to talk about the logical inconsistency, the contradiction.
All right, so let's put a pin in the idea of, do you have to believe in the Trinity to be saved? You say you think you do believe that. I definitely want to ask some questions about that. Let's get back to that in a second. So right now we're on, so we are defending the Shema, that there is one God, and we are defending that the Father and the Son are not the same, so there are multiple persons in the one being God. This is the Trinity, if I'm summarizing it very quickly. And so then Blake Ostler says, and I think you're going to play a clip, that this is just an outright contradiction then. Right. Again, I think because of terminology, speaking past each other and not really understanding what it means to be God and what it means to be a person and what it means to be a being, Yeah.
Yes. Okay, let me play these clips. I'm still sharing, right? Okay.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, on one construal of essence, it entails multiple divine beings and therefore a form of polytheism. And on the other, it entails another heresy, modalism, that the Father and the Son are the same being, the same essentially divine person. And so depending on how you look at substance, but either way of looking at substance, you still come up with a heresy. And so on either side of the traditional view, you have heresies, and the middle way, which they can claim to adopt, is just a logical mess because it asserts what it denies.
I think he actually got that right. He said on one construal of essence, you end up with multiple beings, which is a form of polytheism. And on another construal of essence, you end up with one person, which is modalism. He actually got that right. He used the terms correctly, I think, even.
But then he said, okay, gotcha. But then he also said, which in essence, he in one moment in there, he said one person or multiple beings or whatever. And he said he equated beings and persons in the middle of that statement. And maybe we could listen to it again, but there was one statement where he equated.
I think it's only about 30 seconds long. Let me play it again.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, on one construal of essence, it entails multiple divine beings and therefore a form of polytheism. And on the other, it entails another heresy, modalism, that the Father and the Son are the same being, the same essentially divine person.
You're right. Okay,
so
I hear what you heard.
Substance, but either way of looking at substance, you still come up with a heresy. And so on either side of the traditional view, you have heresies, and the middle way, which they can claim to adopt, is just a logical mess because it asserts what it denies.
Yeah, he said that.
It almost sounds like he misspoke because he corrected himself.
He may have, and maybe because he said that on the other hand, there's the heresy that they are the same being, which is not the heresy, because you would argue they are the same being.
Right.
Then he said essentially the same divine person, and that is where he equated
And-
being in divine person.
And I want to be sensitive to the fact that in a podcast, he is speaking off the cuff. It's he's not reading something that he wrote. He's just speaking colloquially. And so I don't want to be too critical of the way he speaks, because I'm doing the same thing. I'm speaking off the cuff, and I'm probably misspeaking and making mistakes. But
the challenge here is that we're using, again, this term being and person.
Mhm.
God is one being in three persons, or three
Right.
persons in one God being. And
right.
that in colloquial language, and Blake Ostler has this issue, I have this issue, and probably many others have this issue.
Mhm.
In everyday language, we use being and person interchangeably. They are, if you identify a being, all persons are beings, and all human beings are persons.
Right. I think in this next clip is where you mentioned a second ago, the transitive property. I think this is where he comes out with that. So let me play this one.
Well, it's obviously a logical contradiction. If we say that the Father is identical to God and the Son is identical to God, from the transitive principle of mathematics, if A is equal to B and B equals to C, then A equals C. That means that they're just identical. And so on its face, this kind of assertion that the Father is God, the Son is God, but the Father is not the Son, it's an inconsistent triad of assertions.
Now, hear what he said there. He said, if you pick the last three, the Father is God, the Son is God, and the Father is not the Son, those three by themselves are an inconsistent triad. The contradiction is found in those three. And I think that's because of the way he's interpreting when I say the Father is God and the Son is God, right? I'm not saying the Father is a God and the Son is a God, because that would not be inconsistent. If the Father is a God and the Son is a God and the Father is not the Son, aha, two gods, we're fine, right? But when I say the Father is God and the Son is God, I mean that the Father is of the one single essence of God, and the Son is of the
Which
one
is why,
single.
so then the first premise is helping to define the God. There is one God, right?
Right.
And so, yeah.
Right.
So as long as you understand there is only one God, which is the first premise, then the second, third, and fourth by themselves contradict. But you do have to understand the first premise.
Right. Right. So for a sec, I want to digress a little bit and talk about mystery, because one of the things he says in the book, I'm going to quote this from the book: I have never seen a carefully spelled out statement of the doctrine of the Trinity that did not commit either the heresy of modalism or of tritheism, unless it simply propounded an unintelligible position or reveled in mystery. Okay, so I take issue with this is just a hang up that I have, because I have read Trinitarian authors and writers who talk about, the being of God is ultimately a mystery, and we can't understand it. And but I take issue with anytime, because this is a very common criticism, and you've heard this from the pulpit in like general conference. Like Hinckley will stand up and say, when I read the Nicene Creed, it's just incomprehensible garbage to me. Like, it makes no sense. It's confusing. The LDS position on the nature of God just makes so much more sense to me, right? And is it Elder Holland who has made fun of the word incomprehensible? He reads part of the Athanasian Creed and he says, well, there's one thing we can agree on. It is certainly incomprehensible. Yuck, yuck. That gets the hair on the back of my neck standing up faster than just about anything, because it's a misuse of the word incomprehensible. There's a word in the Latin, the original language version of the Athanasian Creed. There's a word in there that gets translated into English as incomprehensible, right? And but it doesn't mean that. If you go look up the word incomprehensible, look up a dictionary definition of incomprehensible, there's two definitions. One of them is impossible to understand, and the other definition, which will sometimes be listed as like archaic or formal, the other definition is grasping. Have you got it in front of you?
No, I'm just saying
unable to be
to enclose, to grasp,
right? Right. Incomprehensible in the sense that you can't wrap something around it, right? You couldn't get in a car and drive all the way around it. You couldn't put it in a net. You couldn't fit it in a box. That's incomprehensible. And the Latin word that is translated as incomprehensible is actually the Latin word immensus, which just means really, really big. you know, and it's expressing God's what is the word? It's an omni. Why am I drawing a complete blank? Omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omniscient.
Well, omnipresent. Is that what you're?
Omnipresent. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. I totally drew it. It's expressing God's omnipresence. It's expressing his
Well, you can't
the
seize
almighty
upon or
nature
grasp
of
it all
God.
or shove it in a box, right? That's the idea here. That
Right.
we're at the Latin.
But it's not saying that you can't understand him, that he makes no sense, or that he's confusing, right? That's not what the Athanasian Creed means to say. And when you interpret it that way, I think you're making a mistake in defining terms, right? So I don't like the word incomprehensible, and like some Christian theologians will use the word incomprehensible and say that that's one of God's attributes, that is incomprehensibility, you know. And one of the clips I played last time, Ostler even says, like, if the requirement is having an exhaustive knowledge of what kind of being God is, then we're all going to miss that mark, right? So he even admits that we can't have that exhaustive knowledge of God, and that's all I would say too. If there's mystery involved here, if there is anything about God that's incomprehensible in the sense that you can't know it, it's that we can't have an exhaustive knowledge of a God. But there's plenty of stuff about God that we can know because he's revealed it to us in his word. And so I am not the kind of Trinitarian who would just, you know, when I get to the end of what I can say about God, that I just kind of throw my hands up and say, oh, whoops, well, I guess it's a mystery. I guess it's incomprehensible. So let's just, you know, I'm going to pack up my things and go home now. I think that's you know, and anyone who would accuse me of reveling in mystery, you know, I take issue at that. So I don't know if I even expressed a coherent thought there,
but back to this idea of, okay, so let's address the logical stuff head on. This is where we said earlier that you just don't follow the logic to the conclusion that it is a contradiction. And yet again, using basic mathematical logic, it is a contradiction unless we can tweak or nuance the premises to a better understanding. One way that I would avoid the apparent contradiction is, and we've been dancing around this, you've said it several times, whatever is one in God is the being or essence of God, right? And I actually, it's serendipitous, I think. I was reading a book last night on the attributes of God, and he pointed out that the word ousia, the Greek word ousia, which we use of the substance, right? It's one ousia in three hypostases, was the Greek formulation of the Trinity in the earliest. Ousia is a Greek language. It's all Greek now.
Greek, so it's all Greek to me. Ousia is a Greek word that is actually a participle. It's another form of the to be verb, eimi. And so when we talk about the ousia of God, I like the word being in English. That's an excellent way to translate that in English.
Just to help people who aren't familiar with the Greek, we translate that ousia into essence, right?
Substance, yeah, substance or essence, yeah, or being. I think those three words are interchangeable.
Or being, because we have. I was just going to point out that many people might be more familiar with some kind of a Latin-based language where we say esse or este, you know, and that means is, or this is.
Essence,
all right, and so the essence is what is.
The danger of a word like substance is that it seems to imply that God is some kind of material substance, you know, that he's a physical thing. We could reach out and poke him, you know, and so I think substance is an okay word. It's a word we've used historically when we're talking about the Trinity. So I'm not going to deny that we should use the word substance, but I like being and essence better, because what we're really saying is we're talking about the existence of God. We're not necessarily talking about a physical or material existence, but we're talking about the existence of God, right? The being of God. And what this author was pointing out was that God's name, Yahweh, is a form of the to be verb, right? He's just, I am what I am. He's the God who is, right? And so when we talk about the one...
Sorry, I keep interrupting because I was going to point out, you know, here I was trying to make this really clear for everybody that essence and to be are related, and it even and it completely skipped my in the stupidness of the moment. It completely skipped my my understanding that the word being, right, is the word to be, right? We use the word being,
right,
as
being, to be.
As
that's
as
the literal.
Yeah. So as an individual. So when you're saying, okay, so what you've just said a second ago, I want to highlight is that anything or any part that by definition you're defining any part of the one God that belongs to all three persons as one is the being of God. And so this is how you define God when defining that first premise of there is only one God, Yahweh, the Lord, Elohim, whatever, that you are saying all properties that belong to the three persons in unity, in essence, in being, is the definition of the one God.
Yeah. This gets really complicated by the doctrine of divine simplicity, because I deny all composition. You just said any properties that belong to God. And I would deny that there are any properties that belong to God. God just is all of his properties in a simple way.
But are there properties of each of the persons?
There are personal properties, the relations of origin, which belong to the persons and not to the being.
Okay.
Anytime we're talking about the oneness,
if there are no properties that belong to God, because then
but even the personal properties are not properties in the sense that you and I would talk about properties, right? Like I'm wearing a red shirt today, right? Actually, that's not a property; that's an accident.
Well, no,
I have
we
blue
already said that the father sends the son, and the son prays to the father. These are properties, right, of the individual persons.
Oh man, we're getting so deep down the rabbit hole now.
Well, here's my point, though. This is we don't need to get into that necessarily, but I just a second ago I was saying that it sounded to me like what you defined, that you were defining, nuancing the one God as the collection of the essence that belongs to all three persons, and anything that can be attributed to the three as opposed to one person specifically.
Right.
Anything that can be attributed
and
to
I think
is kind of,
and I think Scripture is clear in attributing all of God's attributes to all three persons. Christ is omniscient, he's omnipotent, he's omnibenevolent, right? He is eternal, and so is the Holy Spirit. And so, I would say the attributes of God are shared among the three persons by virtue of the fact that they all are, and this is Scott Swain does use the word identical. The Father is identical with the one simple essence of God, and the Son is identical with the essence of God. The danger is thinking of the essence and the persons as four separate things, and that's a wrong way to look at it too. The three persons simply are the one essence, and vice versa. So they're not four different things.
Right. Okay.
There's mud.
So all of the attributes that they share are a part of, or not a part, because you don't like that word, and then we got to get into this word thing in just a second. But they are They are the one God. Those attributes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Let's
and so anytime I talk about God being one, so think about the law of non-contradiction, right? The law of non-contradiction is that if we say that something is both A and not A, then we're violating the law of non-contradiction. And that is a contradiction. It's a contradiction to say that something is both A and not A, right? So I say that God is both one and he is three. And I say that with the oneness of God and the threeness of God have equal ultimacy, right? And it sounds like a contradiction because it sounds like I'm saying God is both one and three, or God is both one and not one, right? Or that God is both three and not three, right? But that's not what I'm saying.
In everything that we, in everyday lingo, one is not three.
Right. What I am saying, to expand the proposition, is that God is one being and three persons. Okay. So I would agree, if I say that God is one being and he's not one being, that's a contradiction. If I say he's 3 persons and not 3 persons, that's a contradiction. But
Or
when I
even
say
if
that
you
he's
said,
one,
real quick, if you said he is one being and 3 beings, would that also
right,
be?
or
And 1
3
person
persons
and
and 1 person,
Okay,
those
it's
are all
this.
contradictions, bald-faced contradictions. But I'm making the claim here, and I realize this could be disputed. I'm making the claim here that when I say that God is one being and 3 persons, that is not a contradiction necessarily. It might be a contradiction depending on how I think of terms like being and person, right? And that's why I would call it a paradox. It's an apparent contradiction. It seems contradictory to me, but it might not be a contradiction, and that's what makes it a paradox, right? And I would claim, based on what we've seen from Scripture, that this is what Scripture teaches, and so it isn't a contradiction. And I know what you're going to say, or what you've already even said a second ago.
We'll head there. We'll head there in a minute. But to sum up, then, what you're saying about Blake Ostler's specific stance is that he says, anytime I've ever read a book or talked to anybody who describes the Trinity and they deny Arianism and Sabellianism, is that what we? Wait, I'm sorry. Now I'm getting my terms confused here. But they deny modalism and they deny. Okay, they deny. This is easier for me.
Tritheism.
They deny modalism and they deny tritheism, and they say no. Absolutely, there is. It's not simply 1 being, 3 being. Anyway, he says that it then becomes a bald-faced contradiction. And your response is,
or that they just revel in mystery, or they throw their hands up, they give up, and just say, "Oh, it's all incomprehensible anyway."
Yeah, but you're saying no. The solution is to be found in that it is 1 being or 3 persons in 1 being. The being
right.
Being,
and if me calling that a paradox means that I'm reveling in mystery, then I guess guilty as charged.
No, but you resolve the paradox. I mean, but by defining being as something different than person, that's the way it's resolved.
And you said this a second ago, that like in our experience, in our everyday experience, every being that we know is a person. Like human beings are persons.
Yeah, it's a 1-for-1.
Human beings are persons. You are 1 being and 1 person. I am 1 being and 1 person. My wife is 1 being and 1 person. And we don't have any everyday experience of a single being who exists in multiple persons, or multiple persons who exist in 1 being. We don't have any everyday experience of that, right?
Schizophrenia comes to mind, but that's.
Yeah, we mentioned that in the last video. I think that's a terrible example. The other one is conjoined twins, of course you do, right? Conjoined twins is another terrible example. But here's the other. Okay, so
yes, but that ends the response to this point of Blake Ostler's is. It's not reveling in mystery. It's not simply a incomprehensible paradox thing, because we're going to define being and person as something that those 2 terms are not used this way in everyday language, but it is something different than what we're used to.
So to continue sort of responding to Ostler, there's a few, I've pulled some quotes from the book. Maybe I shouldn't read them, but there's a few spots in the book where he makes the claim that, well, in one spot he says this, and I'm sorry, I haven't got page numbers. I'm not citing these in a scholarly way, but this is all from chapter 6 of volume 3 of his book. So he says in one spot, if God is a personal entity, then it seems impossible for 3 persons to have in common this 1 person. Okay, and then in a different place, he says, because the Father and the Son each have distinct intrinsic properties that identify them as uniquely who they are, it follows that the Father and Son must be conceived of as distinct individual essences, right? So in the first quote, he seems to be saying, well, if God is personal at all, then it seems like they all 3 have to share the 1 person of God. And in the other quote, he seems to be saying, well, if they've got any distinct properties, then they must all be separate essences, right? And again, he's not saying that I say that. He's just saying, like, if I try to follow the logic, it seems to me to lead to these conclusions necessarily, right? And it seems like, he doesn't get into this in the podcast, but it seems like he has heard of what I've just said, that no, the way that I resolve the paradox or the contradiction is I say that The oneness of God is always a oneness of his being, his essence, and the threeness is always a threeness in persons. And as long as we keep those two terms separate, that there isn't a contradiction. He seems to be aware of that, because in one place in the book he gives this example of something that he thinks it doesn't make any sense. He says, and he's using different words. He doesn't use the words being and person here. He's using different words. It seems simply incoherent to assert that Buddy is the same mammal as Spike, but that Buddy and Spike are not the same dog. So he's taking the words person and being, he's substituting in the words mammal and dog, and he says it makes no sense to say that two different dogs are the same mammal but different dogs, right? And like, I get it. Like, I get what he's saying, and like, but here's the thing that I think he's failed to grasp about the way we talk about God. And this is actually kind of debated between different circles. I think this is a Reformed view that I'm about to express, and some people disagree with it. But the Reformed view is generally that when we speak about God, we are not speaking univocally. Okay, univocal and equivocal, right, are different ways of speaking. Univocal means one meaning, right? If I say that this banana is yellow and this taxi cab is yellow, how am I using the word yellow? I'm using the word yellow univocally, right? I mean the same thing when I talk about a yellow banana and a yellow car, right? But when I say that the banana is yellow and maybe that's not a what are two mean? That yellow is not a word that has two meanings. If I say that God is incomprehensible, or that my math homework is, if I say my math homework is incomprehensible, I'm using cowardly. Two. Well, but I'm going to go there. I'm going to go there next. But take a word like incomprehensible, which we discussed earlier as having two different definitions, right? If I say that my math homework is incomprehensible, I mean I can't understand it. If I say that God is incomprehensible, or if I say that this elephant is incomprehensible, I mean I can't wrap something around it, right? Now I'm speaking equivocally, meaning two different meanings of the word incomprehensible, right? So when I say that I am a person, and when I say that God is a person, I do not mean that univocally. I do not mean the same thing when I call God a person as when I call myself a person. But nor do I mean those two things equivocally. I don't mean that it's two completely different meanings of the word person. The way that I mean that is analogically, by way of an analogy, okay? And that's, I think, where if we'll go back to the word yellow can mean cowardly, but is that another meaning of the word yellow? Maybe that's another definition of the word yellow. Maybe that's not an analogy. What's a better analogy? Like if I said that Philo T. Farnsworth is the father of the television, right? He didn't father the television in the sense that he like sexually reproduced the television, right? But he is the father of the television in a sense, right? In the same way that a father is the father of his own child, Philo T. Farnsworth is the father of the television, right? And all analogies have truth so far as the analogy holds, and then they have, but where the analogy breaks down, it's no longer true, right? So analogical language, when I say that God is a person and I'm a person, I mean that by way of an analogy. And that is a true statement. I can say God is a person, and that's a true statement so far as the analogy holds. But at some point, the analogy is going to break down, and it's no longer going to be a true statement, right? Does this make sense where I'm going? I know we've talked about this before, you and I, and you do not like this whenever I bring this up. But
I have some really hard feelings about all of this stuff, that because I have done some linguistic studies and things, and I mean, I don't want to jump in too early, but the short version is then what you're doing is just making up words, right? We've just decided that there is no part of God that God actually truly is incomprehensible. We've now, to me, you have now dived into what Blake Ostler might accuse you of talking about mystery.
Reveling in mystery. Yeah.
Because you're now making up an entirely new language about God, saying, well, persons, when we talk about God, don't mean persons.
Right.
And beings, we talk about God, don't mean beings. And so we might as well just say that God is one jumble juck in three bucks, and that is why he's still one, whatever, because the buck isn't used the way you use it in normal language, and neither is the jumble juck, and so whatever. It becomes incomprehensible, literally, and mysterious, because now we're using words that don't mean what we use them to mean. So why even say God is one being in three persons if we don't mean being and we don't mean persons?
I'm trying to find where, because Ostler goes the exact same place that you just went. He says right here. If a church required its adherents to believe that all blicks are crogs, we can believe it only if we know what blicks are and what crogs are and how they relate to one another. He goes to nonsense words because that's, but that's not what I'm doing. I'm not saying that I'm using the words person and being equivocally, right? I just said that. I just denied that I'm using the two words equivocally, and I claimed that I'm using the words analogically, and that as long as I am using them analogically, that there is truth to those words, the way that I am using them. And I would make the claim that I'm not the one who made up these words, that God is the one who delivered to us revelation about himself by taking our language on his lips. And so when he speaks of himself, he's using our words and he's speaking of himself analogically, right? So it's not just me making up words. I think this is the way God's revealed himself to us, by condescending to use our language. And so everything that we can say about God is we don't ever speak of God univocally, and it's because of the creator-creature distinction, right? God is qualitatively different from us. So but I guess I can't say that he's a person or a being in the same way that I'm a person or a being, or I'm denying the creator-creature distinction, right? I'm saying that the gap is crossable. I can get across that gap, and I can say things univocally about God. And I just don't believe we can do that.
It's a consistent argument. I will give you that it's very consistent, because if you are going to say that we're separate creatures and so on and so forth, you can't then use the same words. The problem is then it does lead directly to this incomprehensible mystery, because in my mind, because you can't then, because no words will describe it. And that I think you would agree that is kind of the case. That is the problem. This is where Blake Ostler is saying you get to this point of just mystery, because, he's the creator, we're the creature. We cannot understand what kind of a being or person he is, because that would make it
But we can, though, is what I'm saying. You're not listening to me, because I can use the word being when I'm speaking about God, and I can use the word person when I'm speaking about God, and there's truth to both of those words. It isn't just mystery or gobbledygook or nonsense. There's truth to both of those words. It isn't the same truth that I say when I'm speaking of myself as a person or a being, but there is a likeness
this is
that
what I'm
is
getting
appropriate.
At. It's not the same,
and there's enough of a likeness that's appropriate that I'm saying true things about God, and I can understand them.
Yeah. And
to you, as soon as I say that I'm speaking analogically, you immediately assume, nope, no such thing. You must be speaking equivocally, and I just deny that.
No,
so
I
are we at an impasse? I don't know, but
I can comprehend somebody speaking analogically, but the issue is that there is no other way in which we use being or person other than the daily use, and this use we're using for God. And so the problem is that since I can't comprehend the difference, then the only way I ever use it is in this one way. It's as if you're saying, an analogy, and I try to think of one off the top of my head, but let's go. What was the analogy that you used earlier when you were talking about analogically? We moved past yellow and green, and you went with something else. What was the last one that you went with?
I don't remember. Roll back the tape.
The father. You use the father of television.
A father. Philo T. Farnsworth is the father of television.
And the thing is that that I can understand the idea of a biological father with sexual reproduction and so on and so forth. And then because we also say I'm the father of an idea, I'm the father of an invention, I'm the father of a nation, like we have all kinds of different ways that we use father, I can see the analogical benefit of speaking that way and saying that I'm the father of some program I've written or whatever. Like I can, like it.
And
makes
so
sense.
your argument then would follow that because we can't know everything about the nature of God, we can see that we may be speaking analogically, but we don't know how the analogy functions.
Exactly.
We can't understand which part of the analogy is true and which part where it breaks down around the edge.
Right, because if the only time we ever used father was in a sexual sense of reproduction of I'm now the father of this biological offspring, and that's the only time we ever used it. And in fact, we essentially said you can't use it to say you're the father of a television. What are you talking about? And if we went around and said you can't be the father of a nation, what? You know, that's if we literally denied that possibility and never used it that way. But then one day someone came along and said, I am the father of, and then used one of those things. And we did. Then you would say, what are you can't, it's not an analogy because we don't use that word.
We don't use that word analogically.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there are so many of these words that when you and I discuss these things that you use analogically about God, but they find no other analogy. Father, in fact, is one of them, right? It's interesting to bring that to the point because when we're talking about the Father of the Son, the Father God of the Son, Jesus Christ, all analogies of father to son indicate a creation of the son. Like every single analogy that you can possibly think of, except the one where you're talking about God the Father and Jesus Christ the Son. There is so the point is if in every single definition of the analogy this is true, father means created son, father means created son, father means created son. Then you get to the Father and the Son and the Scripture, and suddenly you say Father does not mean created Son. You're like, this doesn't work, and this does not fit the analogy.
Yeah, and in that case, well, and I don't want to get too wrapped around the axle on that, but in that case, I would say that the analogy is speaking about a kind of fromness. Scripture all over talks about the Son being from the Father, and you know, we talk about eternal generation. That fromness that the Son has of being from the Father, that he's just always been from the Father in some eternal sense. There was never a time before when he wasn't from the Father and then something happened and now he's come forth from the Father, you know, at a point in time. He just, that fromness that he has is an eternal fromness, right? And that's, so I think there are like, we can get into some of the specifics about where the analogy holds and where it breaks down. But I do have to agree with you that because we don't have an exhaustive knowledge of God's nature, that the analogy there's a part of the analogy that will not be understood by us. I have to concede that point. So, but I think that's precisely what we should expect. If God is on the other side of a creator-creature distinction, if he's qualitatively different from us, if he's infinite and we are finite, that's exactly what we should expect. So if that's me reveling in mystery, if that's me, you know, I guess fine. But I don't think it is. It's not the kind of, oh, it's incomprehensible, I can't understand it. Like, I think there's lots that we can understand and do understand. And it's because God has condescended to reveal himself to us that we can understand all of that stuff. And so if if I do ultimately end up in a place where I'm reveling in mystery, it's not where I started. I didn't immediately throw up my hands and say, "Oh, I can't understand it," right?
So the last area that I think that you wanted to address,
well,
I think,
so I want to point out one more
understand
thing,
it.
and then maybe we should knock off, because we've been going for how long have we been going for?
A
Maybe
little
we
over
should
an hour.
save the last part for one more video. But the last thing I want to point out is, like, we do have an example in our everyday experience where we have this kind of apparent contradiction. And I'm getting this from, there's a theologian named Millard Erickson, and I don't want to sound like I'm endorsing him, because there's a lot about his Trinitarian doctrine that I take issue with. But one of the things that I do find helpful in his explanation is that he points us to an example in our everyday experience that feels like a contradiction, but it really isn't. And that is, he points out what's called the wave-particle duality. And as a kid in school, you probably heard about this, that light has been observed through various scientific experiments to be both a particle and a wave, right? And how do we reconcile those two things, right? And science has been kind of wrestling with, and it's really interesting. You know, we point up the 4 different premises, and we say that the denial of any one of these premises results in another position, right? If you go and look at the Wikipedia page for the wave-particle duality, there's 4 different sections in there. There are some scientists who just say, oh, light is only a wave, and anytime you think it's a particle, you're just getting something wrong. There's scientists who say, no, it's only a particle, and anytime you think that it's a wave, you're just getting that wrong. There's other scientists who say it's both a wave and a particle, and there are other scientists yet still who say it's neither a wave nor a particle. So it's interesting that you kind of fall out with the same, like, heresies and orthodox positions, you know, around the wave-particle duality, as you do about, like, Trinitarianism, right? We have this apparent contradiction that God is somehow both 1 and 3, and then we kind of all line up around, like, well, I deny that premise, or I deny this premise, right? And in science, we have this same issue kind of with light. Is it a wave, or is it a particle, or is it somehow both? And if it's somehow both, I don't think anybody has ever satisfactorily resolved that contradiction. But because we've observed it, we say it's actually a paradox. It's not a contradiction. We're pretty sure it's true. We don't know how it works out precisely. We've got various different theories and models about how it works out, but at the end of the day, we don't think it's an outright contradiction, right? And I think that's helpful. And I hate analogies for the Trinity, because I think they're all terrible. Like, oh, God is a clover, you know, and the Father is one leaf, and the Son, or ice and water and vapor, or whatever. You know, all these analogies of the Trinity are terrible. They all result in what they really picture is one of the heresies. There's not a good analogy that truly pictures the Trinity. So I'm not putting forward the claim that the wave particle. I'm not putting forward the claim that the wave-particle duality is somehow an analogy for the Trinity. I'm just saying it's another example where we have an apparent contradiction that we have to resolve. So I do think it's interesting that Scripture says that God is light, you know. But I don't want to make too much of it. I'm not saying that God is literally light, and that somehow light being both a wave and a particle teaches us something about God being. I'm not even saying that. I'm not trying to make a direct, you know, connect the dot like connection. I'm just saying this is another example that we have of an apparent contradiction that we think is not really a contradiction. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but take that for what it is.
It's mysterious.
Well,
I mean, hopefully the point though with the
but do
wave
scientists, when
particle
scientists talk about the wave particle duality, do they revel in mystery?
Yeah, no, but
I don't know.
but they don't also sit there and think we'll never be able to figure this out. You know, we're going to understand this, and that we're trying to make this work. And what I get when we discuss how God is one being and 3 persons, is that we say, well, yeah, we've made it work by making these words mean what we want them to mean, which is something we don't understand. Anyway, so it just. It does. It's not something that eventually we're gonna.
The difference is for us to really work out, you know, how this apparent contradiction isn't a contradiction. It's going to take more revelation from God. We're going to have to, and be like, we don't need revelation from God to learn more about the wave particle duality. We can continue to experiment. We can continue to observe. right? But everything we know about God, we've received from God through Him speaking to us. And so, if we're going to know more about the triune nature of God, He's going to need to speak to us more. Or maybe it's there in Scripture, and we just need to dig it out, right? We need to keep studying Scripture, and we need to keep going back to the source and learning more and more about it. So,
well, so yeah, let's. I would love to keep going, and I guess where we're headed for the last part for the next video will be: do you need to understand or accept or believe this version of the Trinity? What is wrong with accepting the 4 points that we've outlined in the way that I accept them, for example? And then where I want to go after we've talked about whether we have to understand the Trinity a certain way or not in order to be saved is, practically speaking, we've talked about this before. If you understand the Trinity the way that you do, and if I understand the Trinity the way that I do, and we both accept the principles, then from a practical standpoint, what difference does it make in our lives? And I think that's going to come back to creator creature, right? That's where that's going to go. It's going to go upstream even one farther. But yeah, appreciate the conversation, and we'll continue this within the next few days. So,
all right.